Chapter 9. Social Falsification, Objectivism and Subjectivism, from Caricatures to Grounding Perspectives.
I believe I can only present my proposed strategy for consensus building, social falsification, as contextualized by a process of nuancing of another set of epistemological positions, objectivism and subjectivism. I do this because it may be that the strategy of social falsification, 19 I aim to put forward is very straightforward, as you will see, however defining the problem it tries to solve, clarifying its main goal, and justifying the importance of such goal, require quite a bit of elaboration. Let us start here. It would probably not be an exaggeration to say that the tension between objectivism and subjectivism is the main theme for both the development of the philosophy of social sciences and for the prospect of a social science in general. This is because most of us do not want to renounce two conflicting conditions we really value. On the one hand, the existence of a reality outside of our mind, available for us to capture, study and describe. That is a single reality. And on the other, the need to accept there is no single absolute way to capture, study and describe that reality. That is a single truth. When faced with this problem, one of scientists' first steps is to run away from the label of postmodernism, perhaps because it is considered both unhelpful and bad press for our theories. We can see this rejection in some psychologists, for example Richardson, 2021, and SLA researchers, for example Long, 2017, Hiver and Al-Hori, 2019. Richardson 2021 tells us that in saying there is no overarching truth above any other truth, postmodernists fall into an intellectual trap in which they need to explain to us why such a statement is not an overarching truth in itself. p. 113. The problem I find with this, and many other criticisms, is that, although they are very well crafted, most of them seem to attack a straw man. Much like with SLA theories getting misinterpreted all the time, philosophical schools are often turned into caricatures and attacked as such. In reality, postmodernism is a label that applies to a number of authors with different and even opposing ideas, among whom we can find some big names such as Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, Jean-François Lyotard, Gayatri Spivak, Richard Rorty and others. I am yet to find a book by these prominent postmodernist figures, and I have looked, where their intention is to declare there is no physical reality, to say that both mind-internal and mind-external reality are literally created through texts, or to adopt such an extreme version of relativism that science as an enterprise would be understood as an altogether impossible prospect. In fact, Jacques Derrida showed great interest in the life sciences in one of his unpublished seminars, entitled La Vie, la Mort, where he dived into molecular biology and evolution to provide insightful perspectives as to how to reinterpret the dichotomy of life and death. In other words, despite unfortunate stereotypes that postmodernism is about denying a mind-external reality, or about dismissing science, the ideas put forward by these authors have completely different intentions, and are much more nuanced. Mostly what these authors address are the problems of fundamentalist styles of knowledge, and their main aim in problematizing language, logic, science, and the arbitrariness and inconsistencies in naive conceptions of reality seems to be the promotion of justice, rather than a sort of agenda to undermine realism. 20. There are some similar traditions, and similarly diverse, that do not get criticized with the same energy as postmodernism, such as hermeneutics and social constructivism, both of which also problematize narratives of absolute truth. I am not sure whether I am arguing that we should per se avoid adopting or subscribing to definite postures such as realism and anti-realism, but at least I would recommend we have a more level-headed understanding of the surprisingly sophisticated ways in which realism is often criticized in the philosophy of social science. Firstly, when postmodernists attack realism, they are not exactly attacking the physical existence of a mind-external reality. Rather, they are attacking its representability, our ability to access or capture reality in an objective and direct, unmediated way, that is, a successfully depersonalized, desocialized, decultured, depoliticized, or altogether dehumaned way. In a strange way, this is not too different from neurological understandings of reality. We only have sensory organs. The sun releases energy, but it takes a human with eyes to see that and call it light. There is no light without creatures with eyes, only energy. Similarly, it takes a human with ears to interpret a thunder's energy as sound, and so forth. Sensory organs, in turn, only send nerve signals to the brain, and it is up to the brain to put everything together and generate a whole reality based on those signals. Thus, our human reality, although perhaps closely based on the external world, is a kind of complex internal creation, a representation of the external world that distorts it in a number of ways. Add to this our cultural frameworks, our experiences, and our psychology, our historical contexts, our pre-made languages that come with pre-built concepts and ideas, etc. And what you get is a uniquely human way to capture reality, where it seems even naive to believe observation and interpretation can be so neatly separated. A second reason why some schools of thought attack realism is that not everything physically exists, or at least not exactly, and thus cannot be real in any straightforward sense of the word. A good example is numbers. Numbers are symbols. Of course, symbols depend on a material reality, our brains, our language production, our production of graphical representations, etc. But although those neural connections, sound waves and Arabic numerals do physically exist, they are not inherently related to each other. We put them together through interpretation and social agreement. There may be 3 stones in the ground, but without a human, the existence of those 3 stones does not immediately allow for the existence of the number 3. Furthermore, 3 stones, 3 doors, and 3 people are not exactly connected by the number 3. They are completely unrelated to each other, but we as humans perceive a pattern, that they come in sets of 3 units. The number 3 becomes real, only as an interpretation. Physicists may capture natural patterns, and make incredible predictions and calculations through the use of numbers. But that could only make the natural patterns real, not the numbers, which are only concepts. Concepts that may or may not correspond to what they intend to represent. Not only that, but some of the objects and phenomena we study in the social sciences are clearly almost altogether socially constructed, and thus they are only real at the level of interpretation, opinion and/or social agreement. For example, justice, rights, money, success, ethics. And as such, our descriptions for our objects of study often come with a great deal of implicit, arbitrary ideological components, which we should be careful before we declare them as reality, a term that would entail the permanence and the essential nature of those arbitrary components. Some other phenomena are more evidently combinations of neurobiologically predisposed traits and social constructs, like anxiety and personality, which may stem and/or be mediated by biological processes, but are also subjectively experienced, described, not to mention shaped by, and interpreted through cultural values. Some other objects of study are combinations of objectively existent physically measurable phenomena and social constructs, like a phonetic comparative analysis between masculine and feminine features of pronunciation, where sound waves, physical entities, are analyzed in reference to non-biological notions of gender, social constructs. Some are a complex and messy combination of physical, neurobiological, experiential, and socially constructed components, like L2 proficiency. In the social sciences, asserting what is objectively real, observable or measurable when we deal with socially constructed phenomena all the time is complicated, with no simple solutions. Recognizing there are no simple solutions also grounds us, because while in public discourse all of the above-mentioned philosophies, often labeled anti-realist, seem to be very distant from more accepted positions in SLA, like critical realism, I would argue they are closer to it than we would expect. According to Cruikshank 2016, there are 2 main reasons why critical realism is critical. The first one is that any fallibilist position has to be critical in the sense that all ideas can be revised or replaced through criticism, p. 277, while the second one is that some critical realists embrace a Marxist spirit of critical theory and the critique of ideologies. Openness to revision through criticism is not too far away from relativism or interpretivism, and a critique of ideologies sounds very much like the postmodernist skepticism of fundamentalist or grand narratives. All of these schools of thought provide their own type of criticisms to positivism, which is not the same as realism or objectivism, and to naive understandings of methods, reason and truth. We can of course include Kuhn 2012 in that list, who although was not exactly a relativist, nonetheless put the problem of interpretability at the forefront of scientific discussions. In doing so, we could say he demonstrated both natural and social scientists struggle with objectivism and subjectivism. Oreskes 2019 illustrates this struggle on the natural sciences side when she writes,
"An important point, stressed recently by David Bloor, is that if we feel the need to contrast relativism with something, we should contrast it not with objectivity, which is the opposite of subjectivity, nor with truth, which is the opposite of falsehood, but with absolutism. The opposite of relative knowledge is absolute knowledge, and no serious scholar of the history or sociology of knowledge can sustain the claim that our knowledge is absolute. Nor can we sustain the claim that empirical evidence alone suffices to explain scientific conclusions. Far too much evidence refutes that hypothesis."
p. 46. The fact that postmodernists, hermeneutists, social constructionists, critical realists and others seem to share a common ground, does not mean, however, that these are the same tradition under a different name. Not at all. There are indeed deep disagreements, contradictory positions, and a diversity of proposed solutions, even among authors of the same schools of thought. The role of the individual and society, structures and agency, social constructs and physical reality, object and subject, along with the role of history, power relations, and values are all subject to much inquiry and debate with direct implications for the tension between objectivism and subjectivism. Yet, these traditions seem to be addressing the same fundamental problems. There are clear recurrent themes we can find in the literature, and I believe we could think of these as the challenges for the prospect of a social science. 1. No one wants extreme objectivism, realism, because it may lead to naive and unjust fundamentalist ideologies. No one wants extreme subjectivism, because by itself it does not seem to allow for integration of ideas. Yet, no one wants to dispense with some form of objectivism, realism, because science needs objects of study, even if there is no perfect way to establish them in non-ideological ways. And 4. No one wants to dispense with some form of relativism, because this would impede the full spectrum of criticism and revision that is needed for science to develop. In other words, we seem to want it all. We want something like an empirical relativism, or a social objectivism. We actually do not have a sort of universal solution to this tricky dichotomy. But while we may lack a perfect solution, I believe a good place to start is this. Just like facts should ground perspectives, perspectives should ground facts. My hope in presenting the problem of objectivism versus subjectivism in the social sciences this way is that we engage with philosophical schools more carefully, and with more respect and admiration, which we can achieve by first understanding their goals may be limited to addressing only one of the 4 challenges above mentioned, that each school is diverse, that specific authors address specific issues, and that the goals of addressing those issues may not be what we expect. Some schools of thought just have bad press. When we attempt to be more receptive of all these schools, we may find that instead of inadmissible positions, strange, laughable, or incompatible with our own, we may in fact find the sorts of grounding perspectives necessary in order to transcend our habits of mind and push the development of our ideas. Not to mention, this may prime us to collaborate with people who originally seemed so far on the other epistemic side of academia to even engage. I also hope to stress the idea that different objects of study confront us with different ontological challenges, and that when we are building theories and discussing how accurate or fair our representation of reality is, we may need to proceed object by object, and issue by issue, rather than through adopting absolute positions, for example realism, anti-realism, that supposedly apply to all objects of study. The particular strategy to tackle the problem of objectivism and subjectivism in the social sciences that I promote here is not based on choosing or devising a philosophy that finally dissolves this dichotomy forever. Rather, my proposal presupposes the social character of knowledge put forward by Longino 1990, and sees solutions in social actions. Social falsification is a social model of interaction between researchers. It can be understood as an act of negotiation in the context of fields like linguistics, applied linguistics and SLA, where all theories claim empirical success, regardless of opposing claims. See Chapter 3, Chapter 4, which is accompanied by considerable epistemic exclusion. See Chapter 2. The main idea is that 2 or more opposing parties engage with each other, ideally with an additional party that can act as a mediator. A particular scientific claim or theory is put to the test through a negotiated methodology and pre-negotiated standards of interpretation. In other words, social falsification takes the empirical spirit of testing scientific claims and combines it with the hermeneutic spirit of elucidating reality through more than one perspective. Social falsification can also be understood as an act of integration, where diversity virtuously exists with collaboration and coordination. Critically, although birthed from philosophical ideas, the model of social falsification is a call to action rather than a philosophy. It tackles the dividing way we conduct science, and rather than prescribing philosophical or theoretical positions, it invites for negotiation and testing of those positions. In that process, methodology is also negotiated, and by the end of the process, the parties also have to agree as to what scientific claims can or cannot be made with the available data. And why are all elements negotiated? Because disagreement exists at all levels: theory, how it should be operationalized, and how it should be interpreted. On this relationship, James Lantolf comments,
"In my view, we need to be concerned with 3 concepts in science, theory, methods, and data, but we cannot look at each in isolation because they are so closely interrelated." Vygotsky. And others have pointed out, for instance, that facts data are very much theory-dependent, and theories very much depend on methods, but methods in turn are shaped by theories.
James Lantolf, Personal Communication, January 24, 2024. To that I would add that theory, methods, and data are all dependent on social groups, and interactions between groups. They are dependent on how diverse and how coordinated the scientific community is. The model of social falsification thus tries to change the scientific mood from competition and unintentional exclusion to collaboration and intentional inclusivity. When consensus is not a moment, but a process in which the whole community engages, then we are forced to come up with some procedures to build consensus, where building consensus is an act of collective fact-checking, one of searching for plausible and fair descriptions of reality, which are elucidated through negotiated truths.
Social falsification and intentional pluralism. Who should participate in science and consensus building?
How is expertise formed? Expertise is often thought to develop mainly through higher education. This journey typically includes working closely with veteran researchers, reading extensively, conducting studies, and participating in conferences to meet other people and exchange ideas. I think conventional notions also assume that expertise can be enriched through projects in collaboration with industries, governments, or communities. However, I fear these perspectives do not fully capture the fact that our knowledge is also framed. It is framed through our individual, extra-academic life experiences, upbringing, assumptions, and values. Because of that, I think it is very important to keep in mind only a small minority of people in the world make it to higher education, which means the nature of academia is to bias science towards a limited set of worldviews, values, and framings. This can lead to epistemic phenomena such as the pedagogy bias discussed in Chapter 7. So what should we do if indeed we form our expertise through the lens of an unrepresentative elite? I think it is plausible to consider intentional pluralism as a scientific virtue, which would help us mitigate such a problem. Intentional pluralism can also be conceptualized as a set of scientific practices, such as intentionally focusing on traditionally understudied populations, but also, as I would like to propose here, including those populations with diverse experiences and values in the process of science making. This can be achieved in two ways: one, by collaboration with researchers around the world who are minoritized and unintentionally, yet systematically excluded, and two, by actually including non-academics in the process of theoretical development. Number one may not be too controversial, and the model of social falsification I have put forward here can support these interactions between researchers from privileged backgrounds and minoritized researchers. But number two may be seen by some researchers as more radical, which is why it needs elaboration. Famously, Paul Feyerabend proposed there is no single method for science, Feyerabend, 2020. But beyond methodology, he also addressed pluralism and the role of people outside of academia generating knowledge.
Mistakes can be discovered by laymen and dilettantes, and often have been discovered by them. Inventors built impossible machines and made impossible discoveries. Science was advanced by outsiders, or by scientists with an unusual background. Einstein, Bohr, Born were dilettantes, and said so on numerous occasions. Schliemann, who refuted the idea that myth and legend have no factual content, started as a successful businessman. Alexander Marshak, who refuted the idea that Stone Age man was incapable of complex thought, was a journalist. Robert Ardrey was a playwright and came to anthropology because of his belief in the close relation between science and poetry. Columbus had no university education and had to learn Latin late in his life. Robert Mayer knew just the bare outlines of early 19th century physics. The Chinese communists of the 50s, who forced traditional medicine back into the universities and thereby started most interesting lines of research, had only little knowledge of the intricacies of scientific medicine.
Feyerabend, 2017, p. 84. These historical cases highlighted by Feyerabend challenge our idea of how knowledge is generated. On the other hand, while it is clear non-academics and laypeople can make important contributions to science, it is more complicated to define how likely is for this to happen, how risky is the inclusion of non-academics, or what role they could systematically play in science making. As it turns out, the role in science that ought to be played by lay people, or variations such as non-experts, non-academics, lay experts, non-scientists and citizen scientists is a topic which is commonly addressed in the philosophy of science. So, to help us with these matters, here I provide three perspectives from contemporary philosophers of science: Evans 2014, Oreskes 2021, and Shaw 2021. Evans 2014, who is concerned with both the danger a technocracy represents for democracy and the risks in uncritical applications of democratic values in the realm of technical expertise, writes,
To see why there might be a limit to expert participation requires paying attention to a rhetorical move that has become increasingly common in the social sciences. In many of the studies that inform the call for more inclusion, the non-scientist experts are often called lay experts prior 2003. This formulation puts the stress on their ordinariness rather than their expertise, and it is a relatively short step from here to argue for more lay without the expert participation. The flaw in the argument is that the lay experts were generally valuable because of their expertness rather than their layness.
Yes. We are warned not erase the value of expertise in our attempt to make science more democratic. But let us not overlook that there is also an openness, or a second warning, that expertise does go beyond a superficial sort of credentialism, wherein our opinion is only heard because we have obtained certain degrees from certain institutions, regardless of actual knowledge or ability. Oreskes 2019, on the other hand, does argue for more lay, without the expert participation. This is because while non-experts may not be able to scrutinize facts through technical knowledge, they can scrutinize the framing of those facts based on their values. Not only that, she presents a few historical cases in which irresponsibly dismissing lay people's experiences and perceptions, which indicated experts' facts could be mistaken, led to disastrous results. And while this position of more significant inclusivity may sound naive to some, Oreskes is extremely careful as to the terms and conditions of non-expert participation. She provides us with 3 warnings. 1. We should not disregard the opinion of non-experts automatically. 2. We should not recognize non-experts as superior or equal to experts. And 3. We should not be naive as to the intentions of external parties entering science or funding certain lines of research with questionable intentions. p. 132. For example, nurses and teachers through years of daily practice may notice things that medical researchers or SLA researchers may lack access to. This, however, only means they have valuable experience and insights, but not that they know more or better. As Oreskes puts it,
just because someone is close to an issue does not mean he or she understands it. Conventional notions of objectivity assume distance for just this reason.
p. 132. But, are teachers lay people? After all, there are many teacher training courses out there, and some are, I have to say, quite expensive and supposedly very prestigious. The answer to that question, however, depends on whether we define expertise as specialization, as holistic and synthetic knowledge, or as a pursuit to erase the lines between science and application. In Chapter 2, I provided many examples showing specialization results in scholars having few opportunities to communicate and understand each other's theories in deep ways, or agree as to how to operationalize theories. As a consequence, specialization cannot be the basis of expertise, because by itself and unregulated, it only seems to lead to fragmented and contested knowledge. One could even validly wonder if experts in our field can really be experts in light of serious theoretical fragmentation. Let us not forget, we lack clear standards of expertise. When we go through teacher training, in the context of scientific disagreement and lack of consensus, it is unclear what we are trained on. In my experience, it is either a dogmatic kind of training, where one theory or thought collective is chosen over others for no reason, or it is an idiosyncratic mixture of theories and findings, often under the term eclecticism. The problem many of us see with eclecticism is that it usually dismisses very real theoretical contradictions and unsettled debates. A step in the right direction would be a bit less dogmatic. A holistic view of the field, an honest one where disagreement is explicitly recognized, would encourage teachers to understand nothing is quite set in stone yet, that we lack unified standards of expertise, with some methodologies leading to some findings, and other methodologies leading to other findings. But by the end of such training, would teachers be experts? This is not clear. The word training is relative to the cohesion and the strength of the knowledge base of a field. Experts in SLA come from many fields, which means that whether scholar or non-scholar, individually we are non-experts in most of the SLA spectrum outside of our own section. Neurologists may not have the most sophisticated knowledge of sociolinguistic theories, and linguists may not know the intricacies of neurological systems or how mental abilities are theorized in reference to those systems, through research. Lay multilinguals may not know about either, but they have first-hand knowledge of what it is like to go through the process of becoming multilingual. L2 teachers, who are occasionally also L2 learners, may have many practical knowledge and skills to teach and learn languages, without necessarily having a deep understanding of why things do or do not work. How could we deal with such fragmentation? Shaw 2021 meticulously breaks down Feyerabend's view, which would completely reinterpret the rules of knowledge-making by substituting the dichotomy of expert versus non-expert, with that of people who engage in a pluralistic, integrative and transformative conversation, and people who are unwilling or unable to do so. Shaw is interested in describing and analyzing Feyerabend's understanding of disagreement, because while his name is typically directly associated with epistemic anarchy, his opinion was not what most people would assume. Feyerabend did set some rules and regulations for generating knowledge, albeit in his own characteristically unorthodox way.
The distinction between the crank and the respectable thinker lies in the research that is done once a certain point of view is adopted. The crank usually is content with defending the point of view in its original, undeveloped metaphysical form, and he is not at all prepared to test its usefulness in all those cases which seem to favour the opponent, or even to admit that there exists a problem. It is this further investigation, the details of it, the knowledge of the difficulties, of the general state of knowledge, the recognition of objections, which distinguishes the respectable thinker from the crank.
Feyerabend, 1999, p. 136. According to Shaw 2021, this Feyerabенdian view entails we could welcome lay experts with open arms, so long as they are respectable thinkers, while people with inflexible views, or even dishonest actors, such as oil companies meddling in the climate research, are disregarded, and interestingly, not because of their unethical intentions, or at least not only because of that, but because in sticking to their opinion in the context of clear evidence that they could be wrong, they become cranks, epistemically speaking. Shaw 2021 further points out that opposite to what we could come to expect from Feyerabend's extreme positions on pluralism, he actually was not against consensus, but his conditions were clear: consensus is temporary, and must be the result of pluralistic discourse. p. 58. Who should participate in science-making then? We can embrace inclusion as much as we want, aided by the above-mentioned conditions, risks, limitations and warnings. But an answer in more concrete and practical terms may also be field-specific. In the context of SLA and multilingualism, sometimes it is difficult to determine whether a community is lay or expert, as it is the case with polyglots, who even hold their own non-academic international conferences. I have seen my fair share of linguists who have memorized an incredible amount of facts about a number of languages, but cannot really sustain even a small conversation in any other than their L1. This is like being an expert in the physics, engineering, history and sociology of cycling, while not being able to ride a bike. SLA scholars are of course more sophisticated in that regard. They have introduced the important concepts of skill, automaticity and socially situated use, which help us understand the difference between learning about L2S and learning L2S or becoming L2 users. But even then, going back to our analogy, we would have to determine whether the expert in cycling is the physicist, the engineer or the Olympian. Additionally, while it is easy to notice and talk about systemic injustices in knowledge making, to actually turn this into a useful and productive perspective for theory building, we need more social action through intentional and carefully designed inclusion. Usually in interviews the participants' perspectives are on the one hand treated as insightful and respectable, but on the other, the participants themselves are implicitly framed as inherently lay. That is, scholars study them, they do not study with them. Multilinguals are not usually invited to take part in the analysis of evidence, the development of theories, or to comment on the framing of issues. Lacking technical knowledge and scientific training, it is assumed that the participant's opinion will be limited and biased. This is of course true, but it implies that the researcher's analysis will not be limited and biased, which as we have seen, is not true. The researcher's interpretation of the data is simply more informed and sophisticated, in some ways less biased, in some other ways more biased, for example, if the researcher is committed to either formalism or functionalism, but never free of bias. So in fact, while lacking technical knowledge and scientific training, many multilinguals with unique backgrounds may still have important perspectives and knowledge to contribute to science. We cannot include them as equal to researchers, but we can include them and listen carefully to their reactions towards scientific explanations. They may have something to say at either the level of values or facts, when it comes to linguistic or L2 development theories, which may lead scholars to revise, reframe or retest their theories. But this would necessitate the platforms and avenues to establish regular, rather than occasional communication between communities, and in turn, this requires we recognize the issue as important in the first place. As we live in a world of technology, with all kinds of low-cost modes of communication, these connections between communities are not a problem of means, but of initiative and organization. To synthesize all of the above, social falsification can only be truly social if we learn to value theoretical and axiological scrutiny from different flanks, in addition to empirical falsification. Because how is expertise formed? Expertise is formed by working on our facts, while negotiating our views on those facts, by looking to the same problem in many ways, and ultimately determining how knowledge can be accurate, robust, fair, and helpful. Policymakers, immigrants, speakers of endangered languages, minority language radio hosts, multilinguals in all sorts of contexts, translators, interpreters, elementary school L2 teachers, teachers in adult L2 academies, textbook makers, learners of all kinds, polyglots, linguists, literature experts, education experts, philosophers, SLA, and multilingualism researchers from various theoretical backgrounds, and more. We all have accumulated experiences with multilingualism and second language development at different levels from different perspectives, and we need each other. Why do we need to establish more connections? Because intentional pluralism is intentional social cognition. 21. A call for more pluralism and diversity in science is not a call for divided identities or chaotic fragmentation of opinions, but for purposeful inclusion, communication, and collaboration.